Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Tonight, we take you across American Midwest for a sweeping look inside some of the most significant federal criminal prosecutions announced in recent days by the United States Attorney Office, the FBI, Homeland Security Investigation, DEA, ATF, and other federal agencies. Tonight's report include artificial intelligence used to create sexually explosive images of children, massive fentanyl trafficking conspiracies stretch across multiple states, multi-million dollar fraud scheme targeting taxpayer and federal aid programs, violent robberies, kidnapping conspiracies, terrorism attacks, and organized criminal investigations. Major federal criminal exploitation crackdowns involving hundreds of arrests nationwide. From Minnesota to Missouri, from Ohio to Iowa, federal prosecutors say they are escalating enforcement efforts targeting violent offenders, child pet predators, narcotic traffickers, fraud rings, and repeat offenders operating across the Midwest. This is your Englebrook Independent News Federal Crime Report. Federal prosecutors in Minnesota announced that a former school district employee has pled guilty to using artificial intelligence technology to create sexual exploitive images involving children who he was under supervision. 30-year-old William Michael Hashlat, formerly employed by Independent School District 622 and Independent School District 834, admitted in federal court that he used photographs of children in his care to generate obscene AI morphed child sexual abuse images. According to prosecutors, Hashlet held multiple positions involving district access to minors between 2021 and earlier 2025, including lunch monitor, traffic guard, paraprofessional, and youth summer program assistant. Authorities say Hashlet secretly photographed children and later used those images with AI morph software to create sexually explicit visual depictions. Federal prosecutors say Hashlet admitted to creating more than 690 AI-generated exploitive images involving at least 91 minor victims. Investigators also allege that Hashlet secretly photographed prepubescent children genitals areas while the children were wearing swimsuits. Federal authorities state that there is no current evidence that the images were distributed online, but prosecutors emphasize the unpredictable scale of the exploitation involving AI-generated content. The case reflects growing nationwide concerns amongst federal investigators regarding the use of artificial intelligence tools to create exploitive children abusive images involving direct physical contact. Federal prosecutors also announced Anthony James Kazimek pled guilty to assaulting United States Representative Ilhan Omar during a Minneapolis town hall event earlier this year. According to court filings, Kazimek rapidly approached the Congresswoman during January 2026 public meeting and sprayed her with apple cider vinegar from a syringe device. Authorities confirmed the liquid was acid. Secretly, personnel quickly subdued the suspect after prosecutors say that he shouted at Representative Omar and disrupted the event. Federal prosecutors state Kazimek admitted to the assault was politically motivated and acknowledged planning the attack advanced because he just agreed with Omar's political view. The case highlights growing federal concerns over politically motivated violence directed at public officials. Federal authorities in Wisconsin unveiled one of the region's largest recent drug trafficking indictments, charging 18 individuals tied to sprawling narcotic conspiracy allegedly operating throughout Milwaukee area rental properties. At the center of the investigation is Samuel P. Stairs, identified by the prosecutor as an owner of a dozen of LLC connections to S2 real estate properties allegedly used drug distribution operation. Federal prosecutors allege Stair knowingly rented apartments to traffickers involving in distributing fentanyl and cocaine, and then used his real estate business structure to conceal criminal activity and launder proceedings. Authorities say coordinators raided in Chicago and Milwaukee led to major seizures, including kilogram quantities of fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, and more than 22 firearms, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, securities, and vehicles alleged linked to the conspiracy. Federal prosecutors are seeking forfeiture of 43 properties holding LLCs, 6 real estate properties, and more than $700,000 in seizure in assets. Several defendants face mandatory minimum federal prison terms ranging from 10 years to life imprisonment if convicted. 2 defendants additionally accused of possession of a machine gun in furtherance of drug trafficking crimes, carrying mandatory minimum of 30 years sentence. Federal investigators described the operation as a major example of organized narcotic trafficking concealed beneath legitimate business structure. In Michigan, a repeat Flint drug dealer known as Killa B has been sentenced to nearly 20 years in federal prison after investigators uncovered what prosecutors describe as a horrifying drug house operation. 46-year-old Bobby Bozeman pled guilty to federal narcotic charges tied to cocaine distribution activities inside the Flint residence. But investigators say the case escalated dramatically during the arrest in August of 2021. Police discovered two severely injured women inside the home, naked, bruised, and bloody, and suffered charismatic injuries. According to court documents, a woman stated Bozeman accused them of stealing drugs and held them captive for days, depriving them of food, with psychologically assaulting and sexually abusing them. One victim reported suffering a collapsed lung while another's eyes was swollen nearly shut. Authorities also recovered narcotics, firearms, and large quantities of ammunition from the residence. Federal prosecutors in Detroit announced that pharmacy technician Ali Narshadan pled guilty to participating in a multi-million-dollar healthcare fraud scheme involving forged prescription and illegal oxycodone distribution. Authorities say Nordison and co-conspirators submitted fraudulent claims to Medicare, Medicaid, and Blue Cross Blue Shield for medication never prescribed and never dispensed. The scheme allegedly cost more than $5.6 million in losses. Federal prosecutors also say Nardines illegally supplied oxycodone prescriptions to traffickers in exchange for cash. The Department of Justice announced the result of Operation Iron Pursuit, a massive nationwide child exploitation crackdown involving 56 FBI field offices. Federal officials say more than 200 child victims were identified, over 350 offenders were arrested, and multiple exploitation, traffickers, kidnappers, and CSAM investigators were indicted nationwide. 8 arrests occurred in the Eastern District of Michigan alone. Federal officials described the operation as one of the largest coordinated child exploitation enforcement actions in recent years. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche stated, quote, "Every child predator should be understood that the federal law enforcement is coming for them. The operation follows multiple similar national crackdowns conducted throughout 2025. Federal prosecutors also announced Detroit resident Brandon Robinson pled guilty to operating decade-long federal student aid fraud scheme involving more than 1,200 individuals. Authorities say Robinson orchestrated fraudulent financial aid applications to more than 100 schools across 24 states. Investigators allege that the scheme generated more than $16 million in fraudulent awards. Robinson admitted responsibility for over $1 million in fraudulent unemployment insurance claims. Federal prosecutors described the operation as industrial-scale fraud against America taxpayers. In another major Michigan federal case, Oz Mohammed Nasser was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison after being convicted for attempting to provide material support to ISIS. Federal prosecutors say Nasser attempted twice to travel overseas to join extremist organizations connected to ISIS. Authorities later discovered what they described as a bomb-making laboratory inside the Michigan residence. Investigators recovered drone equipment, explosive chemicals, bomb-making instructions, and components for improvised explosive devices. Federal officials say Nasser remains deeply radicalized for years and maintains connections with extremist supporter online. In Ohio, federal prosecutors announced that repeat offender Darren Porras was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison after investigators uncovered fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, firearms during a raid in Akron. Authorities say Portis committed the crime while already on parole for previous violent offenses. Investigators recovered loaded weapons, narcotics, scales, and cash from the residence. A Tumbler County man received more than 7 years in federal prison following a deadly 2025 conviction shooting in Warren, Ohio. Federal authorities say the fight escalated into a mass shooting involving multiple armed individuals outside a store. One person died and another was injured. Federal prosecutors say Ricardo Gibson pled guilty after investigators recovered 6,400 child sexual abuse files from an electronic in Ohio. Authorities say Gibson used online platforms to pursue women selling child's clothes, then sent explicit material involving minors. Agents additionally recovered firearms and disturbing evidence during a federal search. Two Ohio brothers and former public officials collectively received more than 55 years in federal prison following a conviction involving bribery, fraud, money laundering, tax crimes, and then thefts on government funds. Federal prosecutors say the defendants used multiple schemes involving investment fraud, cryptocurrency ventures, real estate schemes, pandemic loan frauds, and corruptions involving city officials. Authorities say he threatened employees and patrons at gunpoint during 10 separate robberies. He now faces up to 30 years in federal prison. Federal prosecutors in Indiana announced that Indianapolis resident Aaron Lofton was sentenced to more than 16 years in prison after investigators convicted him to a fatal fentanyl overdose. Authorities recovered hundreds of grams of fentanyl, counterfeit Xanax pills, firearms, cash, and pill manufacturing equipment from a residence. Investigators say the narcotics distributed by Lofton directly contributed to the victim's death. David Witchell of California was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to marijuana trafficking conspiracy and money laundering charges tied to Operation Extended in Indiana. In Illinois, federal prosecutors in Chicago announced a seventh arrest tied to a violent Wichita home invasion involving kidnapping allegations and demand of cryptocurrency access. Authorities say armed suspects posed as food delivery personnel before forcing entry into the residence. Investigators allege victims included children when restrained at gunpoint while suspects demanded access to safes and digital accounts. Federal prosecutors say the defendants remain presumed innocent pending trial. A Chicago police sergeant has been federally charged with allegedly obtaining more than $41,000 in fraudulent PPP loans using fake bakery businesses. Federal prosecutors say the application contained fabricated payroll and business expenses information. Federal prosecutors also unsealed charges against businessman Ray Nazar, accusing him of orchestrating a fraud scheme involving false freight invoices and inflated bakery franchise valuation. Authorities say the scheme generated more than $4 million. Investigators allege fraud proceedings financed luxury vehicles, including a Lamborghini Huracan and a BMW M8. Federal prosecutors announced charges against a California man accused of bulgarizing pharmacies across numerous states, including Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Authorities allege that the suspect traveled nationwide stealing controlled substances including oxycodone, methadone, morphine, and hydrocodone. In Iowa, an Iowa man received 50 years in federal prison after investigators discovered hidden cameras recording involving 5 minor victims. Federal authorities say Trevor John Clisson secretly recorded explosive videos using concealed cameras. Another disturbing Iowa case involving Tyler Boyd Palovic, who pled guilty to secretly placing cameras inside portable toilets at schools' cross-country events and public festivals. Federal authorities say footage included minors under the age of 12. Federal court across Iowa also hand down multiple methamphetamine trafficking sentences involving repeat offenders and large-scale distribution conspiracy. Several defendants received lengthy prison terms ranging from 4 years to 18 years. Federal prosecutors announced Iowa farmer Kurt Karufs pled guilty to bankruptcy fraud after admitting he sold more than $250,000 worth of grain proceedings from a business partner and concealed income during bankruptcy proceedings. In Missouri, a former high school teacher was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after admitting to distributing child pornography through the Kik messaging platform. Investigators recovered hundreds of explicit files from electronic devices. Federal prosecutors announced a 30-year sentence to Mohammed Toks Mohammed in connection with the kidnapping that resulted in a death. Authorities say the defendant fled the United States after abandoning the victim's children in Iowa before later being apprehended internationally. A Kansas City woman has pled guilty to allegedly attempting to ignite a warehouse using Molotov cocktail. Authorities say the warehouse had previously been linked in media reports to possibly federal immigration detention use. The defendant later paid more than $43,000 in restitution. Federal prosecutors also announced that a Missouri woman pled guilty to importing and selling more than $2 million worth of counterfeit luxury merchandise online. Authorities say the operation involved products manufactured overseas and distributed online boutique business. In Kentucky, federal prosecutors also charged Braylon Weaver in connection with a deadly armed bank robbery in Bray, Kentucky. Authorities allege Weaver entered a U.S. bank branch and fatally shot 2 employees before fleeing. Investigators later pursued Weaver at a speed exceeding 100 miles per hour before capturing him after a crash and overnight manhunt. Federal courts in Kentucky also hand down major sentencing involved child sexual abuse material, attempted enticement of a minor, and methamphetamine trafficking. One defendant posed hundreds of explicit videos and thousands of illicit images involving minors. Federal prosecutors in Arkansas announced that former bank employee Laura Parrish was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison after stealing more than $400,000 from the bank's customers. Authorities say Parrish used customers' funds to pay personal credit card bills and even opened fraudulent credit cards accounts using victims' identities, including one victim who had already died. Investigators say the theft occurred over multiple years and impacted numerous customers. Federal prosecutors across the Midwest continue to pursue an expanding range of criminal investigations involving narcotic trafficking, child exploitation, organized fraud, terrorism, violent crimes, and public corruption. Many of these investigations remain ongoing, and in multiple cases, defendants are presumed innocent unless proven guilty in the court of law. For continued coverage of federal prosecution, organized crime investigation, public corruption cases, and nationwide law enforcement development, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haley Ficuciello. Good night.